Let's take a journey through animation.
Hello everybody, I am Matterhorn Matt.
And I'm Jeremy.
And welcome to episode 1 of Journey Thru Animation. This is the very first episode of our brand new series. Let's give you guys a rundown of what this show will entail. We will be having a discussion about every Walt Disney Studios animated film, giving our impressions and some background about each film and its place in the Walt Disney Company's history. This episode, we are going to be discussing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Before we begin, let's delve into a little bit of our personal history with the film. Let's go ahead and start with Mr. Jeremy over here.
So I'm sure this is one of those films that the first time I saw it, I was probably 2 or 3 years old. So I can't really pinpoint the first time that I saw this film. But it was most likely in the very late 90s and on one of the VHS releases. That I can guarantee. I'm not sure whether the film scared me or not. I don't think it was one of those ones. And I never watched it a ton when I was a kid. I know I watched it more than once, but I don't really have any sort of I'm sure I enjoyed it. I'm sure but I don't think it was ever like a personal favorite of when I was a kid. So yeah, it's not one that I always kind of carried with me. Of course, as with everybody, because it's so well known, there's an instant respect for it. But I don't think I ever really had a strong opinion about it when I was a kid. So very kind of ambivalent personal relationship with the movies that just revealed. How about you, Matt? What's your personal relationship with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?
Yeah, pretty much the same as you. I remember watching this as a kid. I can't necessarily pinpoint the exact time. I think we still have the VHS of Snow White somewhere in our movie closet, whatever we want to call it. Yeah, but as many of you guys know, I never really got the chance to watch other better, I guess that's sort of weird saying that, other better Disney films like Bambi or Dumbo or Fantasia when I was a kid. So I remember always tuning into films like Snow White. And I remember, I guess, being neutral, sort of like you said, as a kid towards this movie. I remember liking the dwarfs a lot. One of my many vivid memories, I guess the only vivid memory I have of watching this when I was a kid is thinking that Snow White kind of looked and sounded like my aunt. I guess if Snow White aged like 60 or 70 years, though. So, yeah, that's my background with the movie.
Interesting.
And now each of us have prepared a sort of opening statements about the film, highlighting our initial impressions after this particular viewing. And I'll go ahead and start off this time. Walt Disney's classic Snow White will forever hold its place in history And while I don't think it's the best animated film the studio ever made, it will always hold a special place in my heart. And, in my opinion, it's not the strongest film story wise, but like most of these original films, it's the characters that carry the film.
And this is my opening statement. Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has achieved a rare cultural status in this country. It's a film that extends beyond the popular culture of the time it was made and into the timeless pantheon of great American artistic achievements. Why then is it, and its protagonist, often met with bouts of dismissive cliches, as if to assume its obsolescence due to its age, not its merits? Films do not exist in a vacuum, true. They are a product of the times in which they are produced. But if Snow White's tinny teenage voice was the only thing the film had going for it, I highly doubt it would be the subject of such timeless admiration. In this fresh viewing of one of Walt Disney's most ambitious feats, I didn't see the often cliche image of a European fairy tale princess, but rather an ambitious and feisty film, both defining and breaking the form at the same time. It's a venture that would have shocked the world, as it did. While it's easy to take feature length animation for granted all these years, especially with the abundance of animated content released per year, it subsequently shouldn't take much on your next viewing to remind yourself that every frame of this film contained something that had never been done before. It was completely new. And one thing that prevailed for me in this particular viewing was this sense of freshness, this sense of breaking out of old ways and conquering brand new territory. For Walt and his artists, it must have been a terrifying process, but as it would turn out, it would also be a rewarding one. And it's clear that through creating a revolution, it would instill Walt's artists with a mindset of freedom through experimentation, always building upon the form they were defining, always breaking through boundaries and exploring a new art form. I cannot recommend this film more, if only to understand where it all began and where it was all headed.
Wow,
And
okay.
that's my response.
As usual, Jeremy's way with wording is way better than mine. That's why he's the writer, you guys. But well, when I came into this, watching this film, knowing we were gonna do this discussion, I figured we weren't gonna have that many disagreements when it comes to the film overall. Maybe some smaller disagreements, character wise, story wise, maybe. But I think we can all agree if we're all watching this, Snow White may not be your favorite film. It may not be the best Walt Disney animated film, but we can all agree that, or I guess give it merit where it is due. That, like Jeremy said, this film is the first of its kind, the first ever feature-length animated film ever done. So we can all give it that praise. And now we can transition into what our favorite parts of the film are, from the characters, from our favorite moments to our favorite songs, etc. So let's start with our favorite character. I'm not sure if we're going to agree or disagree on this or not, but I have my favorite character, Snow White herself.
Oh.
Yeah, that just from that, I feel like we're going to have something different. For me, Snow White is portrayed with such innocence throughout the film. From the very beginning, she's thrust into the story, almost getting stabbed to death by the huntsman. And when she assumes the dwarfs are orphan children as well, very sweet moment. I guess it's also a tie between Snow White and Doc. I love the way he mixes up his words when he talks. He's really one of my favorite, I guess he's my favorite dwarf out of all 7 of them.
Yeah, Doc is my favorite dwarf. Absolutely. I mean, I love the way he stumbles over his words. It's great. It's so funny. Favorite character. You know, what's funny, Matt, is I was reading before we recorded this. I was reading a review by the late Roger Ebert about Snow White, and the way he frames his review is really interesting. Is that he says that a lesser film would have Snow White actually be the central figure in the film, but the film seems to be centered on the dwarfs and the queen, and so those characters' motivations, their personalities become so well defined that you can't help but be more interested in those characters. So, favorite character. Oh my God, favorite character. Well, it has to be, and this is going to be a similar answer to another thing we have, but I think it has to be the queen. She's the most
Mm.
complex and she's fascinating. She's the first character you meet in the film. So you're kind of introduced to her wants and needs right away. And yeah, yeah, Snow White is, if she wasn't surrounded by all of these people, all
Mm.
these figures, it would be hard to fall in love with her. And so I guess the queen is my favorite character because she's so well defined and so well um, developed. Uh, and if I could count all of the dwarves as one character, I would do
Mm.
it too, because their character development is so just brilliant. Um, I could go on about that, but I'm sure there'll be more opportunity to go on about that as we continue.
Yeah, I figured you'd pick the queen, and that was sort of, I guess, my runner-up behind Snow White. I'm sure we're gonna have a lot more discussion about the queen because she is,
Mm-hmm.
like Jeremy said, she is one of the greatest, or I guess, greatest characters in the film besides, the dwarfs and Snow White, of course. Yeah, we're gonna be getting more into the queen, I'm sure. So let's talk about the dwarfs themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on all 7 of the dwarfs from this film?
Quite simply, they are the film. I mean, think about the title. People think it's Snow White's film, but that's just not so. I mean, it is
Mhm.
called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's not or the Seven Dwarfs. It's not.
If the
It's
7
not like
dwarfs.
it's not also on the side the Seven Dwarfs. No, it's about all of them together,
Mm.
and they spend a lot of time with the dwarfs, and they're so well developed. One of the things that stood out to me specifically in this viewing that I had never noticed before, and I think it's because we just know their names by
Mhm.
human. You're born and you know the Seven Dwarfs names at this point in society. Um, but I didn't notice this. When they enter after, when they come back home, all the dwarfs' personality, every dwarf has a moment where their personality is showcased before you learn their names. So
Oh,
you see
okay.
Grumpy being hit, you see his personality be developed, you see Doc's personality be developed, you see Dopey's personality be
Mm.
developed, you see Sneezy sneeze, and he it's a very funny line. He says that he has hay fever. I never noticed that before. You see Sleepy, you see Bashful, you see all of them establish their personalities so fully and so clearly before you even learn their names. The first time you hear hear Doc's name, I think you hear Dopey's name. Um, but the first time you hear all of their names, and I wonder if this would have been just like a punchline at the time if you had never seen the film before. Is It's not until Snow White guesses what all of their
Mhm.
names are that you hear their names for the first time. So I wonder if at the time that would have been like a punchline and really funny, hearing like, "Oh, his name is Sneezy." That's hilarious, as opposed to, like, "Yeah, that's Sneezy." So, but I had never really taken time to consider that their personalities are so distinctly established before we even are told what their names are. And I thought that is such a genius character development. The character development is not in the saying of the characters' names; it's shown to you.
Mhm.
You get to know Sneezy before you're told his name is Sneezy, and you're like, "Oh yeah, of course his name is Sneezy." It's brilliant.
Interesting. I never. Okay, well, thank you for
Yeah,
pointing that out. I never
I
noticed
never
that as
noticed that.
well.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, well, I feel like we should spend at least a little bit of time talking about the dwarf who has the most character development in the film. Grumpy. Of course, he starts
No,
out.
I was. That's really. I was thinking, who could it be? Is it Dopey? Is it Doc? Is it I guess it's Grumpy. I agree with that. Say what you're gonna
Well,
say.
I guess before we get into, you mentioned Dopey. I have written down here. Fun fact, you guys. Dopey never talks in the film, of course, we know that. The only time we hear Dopey's voice is when he goes up to check on Snow White, or when he goes up to, all the dwarfs make him go up the stairs to check up on what kind of monster is laying in their beds. And the only time we ever get a hint of his voice is when he yells and then runs back downstairs. That's the only time we ever hear his voice. But, moving on to Grumpy. Of course, I think he's the only dwarf with what you can call, I guess, character development. I'm trying to think, if Doc, I feel like, Grumpy is the main dwarf who has all the character development, just because he starts out as, of course, he's grumpy. He doesn't like, it's, right off the bat, you can tell from what he says, he doesn't like women. And then throughout the course, he doesn't, it feels weird to say that, but he comes off very cold
it's true. That's what his character says in the movie.
I mean, yeah, he does say that. Of course, he comes off very cold to Snow White at the very beginning once they first meet. Once they're all in their bedrooms, they find Snow White sleeping in their bed. He tells Doc to make Snow White go away. And of course, Snow White convinces them to let her stay because she can cook very well. And of course, you see throughout the film, Grumpy sort of warms up to Snow White, and it all culminates to the very end when, of course, the very end of the film, when the dwarfs are all carrying Snow White to, I think they're carrying her out to the coffin that they made her, and we get this one little brief moment with Grumpy, and he actually, he cries because he learns to care about Snow White throughout the course of the film.
Yeah, it's a really good moment. It's a really good moment. Something I found that was really interesting is I never really considered this before, but I think I mentioned this earlier. The dwarves are they're like vaudevillians. They're like they're like physical comedians. They're the physical comedy act. But one particular dwarf reminds me of a very famous comedian of the time. Dopey reminds me of Harpo Marx, of the Marx Brothers. And if you don't know who Harpo is, you should look him up. Basically, yeah, that's all I'll say.
Moving on to our favorite moment in the film. For me, well, I guess let's go ahead and let Jeremy start. I started with my favorite character, so why don't you go ahead and tell everybody.
This is difficult because I think it's going to transition into talking about songs, because songs are such defined moments. That's why the songs work so well in the film. It's because they're scenes and they're not just songs, they're sequences. So favorite moment is definitely oh God, I have a tie. Okay. One of my favorite moments is, it's such a brilliant sequence, so well animated, so well executed, would have shocked, well, it did, it terrified young children in the audience. Is the queen creating the potion and drinking the potion. It is classic. It is genius. It's perfect. It's great. It implores great elements of horror. And to do that in color, animated, I mean, it would have terrified people, and it does. It's really great. But I think my all-time favorite moment is possibly, oh God, what's that? Well, I have to look up the name of the song, but it's when they're after they've eaten dinner in the cottage and they're all dancing around. It's such a great sequence, and you've already fallen in love with the dwarves at that point. But it's just such a great breaking of the tension after the queen drinks the potion, and we know what her plan is, and then we get this wonderful celebration, this kind of extended number of just everyone having a great time, and it's so well done, and everyone's personalities just comes out, and it's wonderful, and it makes it more tense when the next morning they all go off to work, and Snow White's left alone. So it just is great, and that transitions into Someday My Prince Will Come, which is the
Uh-huh.
really the that song would not work without that moment before of everyone celebrating and having a good time. It's such a great moment.
It's funny because that is my favorite moment as well. Also
Great.
tied behind the scene where the queen turns into the, her potion brewing moment as well. So
Of course, it's brilliant.
great minds think alike, as they say. Yeah, that whole yodeling, I call it the yodeling scene, but I guess professionally it's called the silly song. Parentheses, the
silly
Dwarfs
song,
yodel song. I have it open on Spotify here. It really is one of my favorite scene in the whole movie. The dwarfs, every interaction with them, I feel like every dwarf gets their own little highlight moment from Bashful when he gets pushed up on the stage to sing, and he's being bashful, being shy to sing, and he eventually works up the courage to sing his verse in the song. And I feel like my favorite part, tied for my favorite parts, is Dopey and Sneezy. Dopey getting on Sneezy's shoulders and dancing with Snow White.
Yeah, I mean, it's great.
Yeah, as well, I feel like as well my favorite parts is when Grumpy is on the screen, and he's got that scowl on his face, and he's playing what is that? It's not an organ. It's another piano type.
Well, it looks like I think it's like a pipe organ.
Pipe,
because it has the pipes, and maybe it's not though, but I'm pretty sure it's an organ, a type of organ.
I think pipe organ was the word I was looking for. He's got that
okay, there you
Grumpy
go.
or Angry has that. Is it? It's not Grumpy, is it? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, his name is Grumpy.
I just watched this movie, you guys. Grumpy playing the pipe organ with his scowl on his face. He's playing it beautifully as well. It's one of my favorite pieces. I guess like little pieces of music throughout the film is hearing the pipe organ and the little melody. Those are two of my favorite moments in that moment, and of course, leading into Someday My Prince Will Come is I guess hands down. Well, I guess we'll get to best song, or I guess favorite song. Whoa, actually, perfect transition into favorite song in the movie. Contrary to what I just said, for me, favorite song is a tie between Whistle While You Work, of course, the classic Whistle While You Work, and I feel like this is sort of an outlier here. One of my favorite songs as well is the song that the prince sings right at the beginning when he meets Snow White. What's it called? One Song, something like that.
Yeah, One Song.
One Song.
I have but one song only for you.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna sing it.
Yeah, those two songs really do. Of course, Whistle While You Work is a classic. I think my favorite part about these old films, I guess you could call it musicals in general, the songs aren't just played for the sake of having a song in the movie. Stuff happens while the song is going. Whistle While You Work, Snow White comes into the cottage, sees how dirty everything is, and then, starts singing a song to help all the animals help her work. Stuff happens while, the songs are being sung, especially with Whistle While You Work.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. I took quite a few notes about how songs operate in this, in Snow White. Because when you think about it, I mean, the revolution, the musical theater revolution of like Rodgers and Hammerstein had yet to have happened. And, what's the Rodgers and Hammerstein revolution, you might ask? This is a Disney channel, not a theater channel. But basically, Rodgers and Hammerstein introduced two major ideas that changed the face of musical theater, and one of which was that musicals could tackle serious themes and ideas. And the other is that songs move action. They move the plot, and not just that, but they come from the characters. They're specific to the personality and the characters, and not just that, but there's stuff going on underneath it that guides the song. So it becomes really compelling and a part of the scene. This had yet to have happened before Snow White. And so a lot of times when people kind of scoffingly laugh at the songs from this film. It's musical theater wasn't. I mean, they weren't going to invent new modes of musical theater.
Hmm.
So what's interesting is that um, songs like "I'm Wishing" and one song, which I don't find to be the strongest part of the. We're actually might. Oh wait, we have a whole segment where we talk about weakest parts, so I'm not going to talk about that. But it's interesting because songs like that are actually standard operetta, European operetta type songs, where you have the woman sing something like that, and then the man kind of calls and responds back, and they fall in love very
Hmm.
quickly. So they're just, the songwriters are taking influence from what would have been the early 20th century musical entertainment. Now, that's not to say that musical theater in the 30s was actually highly experimental, and that'll be reflected in later films of the big five that we'll see and we'll talk about.
Hmm.
But operetta was a bigger influence. That being said, to answer the question, my favorite my favorite song, or should I say musical sequence, really,
Mm.
is because I actually think it's one sequence, is the from "With a Smile and a Song" to "Through Whistle While You Work." It feels like one song to
Okay.
me. It
Hmm.
feels like one musical sequence, and it's a fantastic sequence. It almost feels like it's its own silly symphony within the larger context of the feature length
Yeah.
film.
Hmm.
And a lot of moments in the film feel like there are these individual silly symphonies, because that's what came before. That was the revolution in animation before feature length animated film. So that's what these animators knew how to do.
Hmm.
And with that, they created this larger canvas of feature length animation. But I love that musical sequence of those two songs. The way that they transition into each other is so good. That was long-winded, but I hope it was interesting.
Yeah. All that talking about musical theater sort of reminded me of that movie, Romeo and Juliet, with Leonardo DiCaprio. Have you guys ever seen that movie? I haven't seen that
Okay,
movie, but that's what it made me
well,
think
first of
about.
all, it's a play written by William Shakespeare.
Uh,
Um,
excuse me, a play, Mr. Musical
yeah.
guy over here. Yeah, I feel like I guess I have a question to propose to you, Mr. Jeremy. Would
Okay.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs work as well as it does without any of these musical numbers that we have?
You know what? I actually thought about that. I was actually asking myself, why did they have musical numbers in here? And I think Walt Disney was always incorporating music into animated works. I mean, the Silly Symphonies was an experiment in using music to tell animated stories, something that would be expanded upon in a really huge way in just a few years, which we'll talk about it when we talk about Fantasia. Um, so I don't think it would work as well,
Mm-hmm.
because the form didn't know how to function without music yet. All cartoons, look at what Warner Brothers doing with their version of Silly Symphonies, which are the Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes. They include music too. Cartoons and music go together, and the reason for that is because cartoons uh, were inspired heavily by vaudeville comedians and vaudeville musical acts, and so um, uh, and so that was reflected in characters like Mickey Mouse, who's really a vaudevillian. Um, in those early cartoons, and music played heavily in the vaudeville form in cartoons. That's what cartoons took from it. So when you get to doing a feature-length animated film, you're still trying to combine these two worlds of, well, we used to do cartoons, but now we're doing these feature-length animated films, and so I think music was a natural element to go into it. But now the music is feeling more like it's a part of like a Ziegfeld Follies review,
Mm-hmm.
which is how you get the more European operetta moments. And of course, the European operetta just fits into the source material. So I don't think it would work, because I don't think animation as a form was at the place yet where it could function without music.
Okay, very interesting. Well, I guess one thing to note is that music is a theme that is carried on even until today in the most recent animated films. So that's something to make note of there as well.
Yeah. And something we'll talk about way later in the series is how the progression of musical theater affected animation. But we're not going to get into that now. But that is a constant throughout the history of animation. It's an interesting intersection between two what would seem to be unrelated forms, are actually very heavily related.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you think about these, especially in my opinion, Snow White, you think about the most iconic moments from Snow White. I feel like most people would just pick out the moments that the songs start playing, like, Whistle While You Work, or even the very beginning, one song, with that main outlier being the scene where the queen turns into the hag, which we'll get to later, you guys. But that transitions us into favorite background animation, and this was sort of a vague, sort of open-ended question, I guess, for me. Favorite background animation. Yeah. Let's go ahead and start with Mr. Jeremy, though. What was your favorite background animation in the film?
Well, first of all, I mean, you have to start by saying that this is the first, well, not the first use, because the first use of the multiplane camera, I think, was in a Silly Symphony that actually came out in the same year. But the multiplane camera affected background art in cartoons and feature-length animated films, and its really first major use in a feature-length animated film, of course, is in this film. So the background art is really interesting because I think I put that parameter there knowing that background art after this film is about to get really, really creative and interesting, especially when artists like Mary Blair and John Hench and Claude Coates come into the picture and really, really push the limits of how background art can establish everything about a film. And Tyrus Wong, of course, really is going to break that boundary open in a couple of films down the line with Bambi, but we'll get there later. So this background art still feels reminiscent of the Silly Symphony age. And of course, in this particular film, one of Walt's goals was creating a tone of realism, of kind of striving to leave the cartoon world and showcase a more sophisticated visual art on screen through animation. And you see that in the background art. My favorite is probably all the forest and woods art. It's really, really well done, and you really, really feel the layers with the use of that multiplane camera. It's really, really good. Yeah.
Okay, very well. Like I said, this was sort of an open-ended style question for me. I put my favorite background animation as, that icon. I think you mentioned it earlier, that scene where Snow White runs into the forest after she's been attacked by, or almost attacked by the huntsman, and she imagines all those scary visuals around her in the forest. Great. That iconic, traumatizing scene. I don't think I would have been necessarily that scared of that scene when I was a kid, but every just that whole scene in general is one of my favorites in the movie, especially with the background animation. This is just amazing.
Me too.
And that can transition us into favorite character animation. And I feel like this is where we're going to start, converging paths here. For my favorite character animation, basically every time the evil queen is on the screen, especially when she gets transformed into the evil hag. We've already mentioned that sequence where she's brewing the potion, but for me, the better part of that sequence is when she actually drinks the potion, when the visuals in that scene, I feel, are more almost unnerving than the scene we just mentioned when Snow White runs into the forest. There's like a close-up of her hand, and it goes from youthful to wrinkly, and it's just sort of gives you the heebie-jeebies for some reason. Yeah, it's that whole scene, in my opinion. We've already touched on this, but that whole scene, in my opinion, especially, I guess just basically anything after from when she gets turned into the old hag, anything after then is my favorite, piece of character animation from the film.
Yeah. The Queen, hands down, is the best character animation well, at least my favorite character animation in the film. And I think it's worth noting about, in terms of animating humans in cartoon form, Snow White sets the precedent. No other animated humans are as natural and complex before Snow White. So that would have been one of the many things about this film that would have been just like inspired awe in an
Yeah.
audience, because you look at previous attempts at humans, even in competitors' attempts at feature-length animation, they're not as nuanced and complex as they are in Snow White. That would have been a huge first. That's like seminal. Anytime you can create life via the arts is a seminal moment in whatever life of that art is. So that's one of the huge seminal takeaways of the contributions that this film has, is animating human beings
Yeah.
and the complexity of the way muscles move, and the way that a whole life, there can be so much underneath one's facial expressions, and how many frames it takes to convey that, what someone's thinking or feeling. It's really great work, and to see where that takes off. So Mark Davis, I believe, animated Snow White, and it's great character animation. And you see and of course he'll go on to be the best character and one of the best character animators ever. And to see him start with Snow White, I mean, it's a great beginning, and you start to see how he puts a lot of nuance in their eyes. You see what they're thinking, you see what they're feeling in a very complex way. It's not
Yeah.
obvious. However, the Queen is the best character animation, because all of the nuance that Mark Davis is going to really, really hone in on is almost already established with the way the Queen is drawn. It's so complex. You see her thinking through the thoughts, the way that she's animated. And the person who animated the Queen is Art Babbitt. And this is where you kind of start to get sad, because Art Babbitt, of course, was the person who eventually would become very dissatisfied with the way that the studio was run, and start the notorious strike against Walt Disney. It's sad to see him leave the studio, because boy, what a talent, and how he would have grown in terms of animation, the way what Disney was doing with animation, the way he would have grown with the company, would have just been tremendous to see more contributions from him with what Walt was curating. Because if you start with the Queen, I mean, where do you go from there? I mean, just so the Queen is so nuanced and brilliant. It's the best.
Yeah, and Jeremy mentioned Disney's earlier attempts at trying to animate humans. If you guys are interested in that, I believe the Silly Symphony is called Goddess of Spring. That was the first,
I think so. Yeah,
the first time the company tried doing that fluid, human-like animation. And if you try and compare that to Snow White, it's miles, miles better. I believe as well, if you find online, actually, I think uploaded on the channel, Tricks of Our Trade, I think it was a Disneyland TV special or World of Color special, one of those. There's a lot of detail in that short film about how, all the research that went into developing character animation, just motion animation in general. Really interesting stuff if you guys are interested in that. And one thing I noticed while rewatching this movie, I had not, for some reason, my brain just hadn't picked up on it before, is that Snow White, the evil queen, before she turns into, the old hag, and the prince, I feel like are the only characters drawn in what you could call, I guess, like quote-unquote realism, whereas the dwarfs have overly exaggerated features like big noses, big ears, etc.
Right, yeah. The dwarfs, and especially the animals, seem to still live in well, even more so the animals,
Hmm.
because the dwarfs have to be more stylized. They do tend to live in cartoon worlds still, you know. But it's interesting seeing those two worlds start to collide together.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I can transition us into favorite voiceover. I feel like
Oh.
moving on, we're gonna have a lot of the same answers here. The Queen, for me, or let's go ahead and start with Jeremy then. What is your favorite voiceover in the movie?
The Queen, of
Oh.
course. She's brilliant. It's a brilliant voiceover when voiceover acting was still relatively young. All these early voiceover actors for these early animated films are always astound me because it was such an early art form to
Mm,
just get behind a microphone and convey thought and character with your voice and the character acting for, I mean, of course radio was a huge thing, but it was different than you know, this kind of environment. um so that's always thrilling, and of course, the witch as well. It's a great voice,
mm,
and it's the best. It's the best voice acting in the whole film, hands
mm.
down. The dwarves have some pretty good voices, but I mean, you really can't beat the queen.
Yeah, my answer is the same, except for what of course, it's better when she turns into that old. Is there like an official name? I had just always called her the old hag. I'm not sure if there's like an official Disney canon name of what she should be called, but I'll just.
I like the old hag. I've always thought like it was like the evil witch, like the evil queen and the
Okay.
evil witch.
Hmm.
You know, but I like old hag. I like that.
Okay. Well, for me, my favorite voiceover is the old hag. I'm not 100% sure if it's the same actress playing the same voice, just doing something different with her voice. I'm Jeremy, if you happen to know any more
I'm trying to
information
look
on
it up.
that.
Well, I know the queen was voiced by Lucille Laverne.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and oh wow, of course. I'm just saying she was involved in the theater. She played Lady Macbeth, which, funnily enough, I was reading about before reading this that the Queen was modeled off of a little bit off of Lady Macbeth type um, personality, which
Mm-hmm.
works so well. I'm trying to see if she voiced.
Well,
Oh,
guys, if you're wondering, Marion
uh,
Darlington voices the
she
birds in
did.
Snow White.
Oh, that's great. But just so you know, she does do both voices, which is
Interesting.
incredible.
Yeah, there's not a lot of voice actors, I feel like, these days who can do a complete 180 on a character, because it's really the Queen is, I guess we can talk some more about the Queen. The Queen is really two characters in one. There's the normal evil queen that you meet at the beginning of the film, and then of course there's the old hag when she drinks the potion. It's really two different characters, and she portrays both of those characters very well, while feeling like the same character but feeling completely different at the same time, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, you really get this kind of manic sense of she's about to exact her delusional revenge. When
Mhm.
she's the old hag, she's it's like she's elated with happiness that she's about
Yeah.
to. It makes it really horrifying. Um, really, I mean, one of the scariest moments in the film is when Snow White is making the gooseberry
Oh
pies,
yeah.
and it's just a straight shot of her, and you see the shadow of the old hag emerge over Snow White,
Hmm.
and the camera just flips, um, you know, 180 degrees, and you just see that straight
Yeah.
shot of the old hag there. It's horrifying. It's great filmmaking, really great.
Yeah. Gosh, and I feel like, I guess another interesting thing that I noticed in this film regarding the Queen, I feel like this is the only, I could be wrong, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is the only time when a character, I guess you can call it, breaks the fourth wall, because when the Queen is
Oh,
brewing
that's
up,
right.
Yeah, when she's brewing up the apple, she looks at the camera, quote unquote camera,
Yes.
multiple times throughout that sequence, and I feel like that also adds to the unnervingness of the whole
Yeah.
situation because no other time in the film, from what I saw, correct me if I'm wrong again, you guys. No other time in the film has any other character broken the fourth wall like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been fourth wall breaking in films. There is all the time fourth wall breaking in cartoons, but it's so effective because that's not something that's established when you're watching the rest of the film.
Mm-hmm.
It's when she becomes really delusional and that she's going to do this and now she's the old hag, that somehow she knows she's performing for an audience and she turns directly to the camera
Mm-hmm.
and direct addresses you. It's horrifying because it's not something that's happened throughout the rest of the film. No other character has done
Yeah.
it. The Queen hasn't even done it. It's really unnerving. Yeah, it would definitely instill the audience with a sense of great unease. And I even wonder if it was even just like, oh my God, that's, even more of a jump scare kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But it's really effective. That's something I noticed too. I'm glad you brought that up. I hadn't really noticed that before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the entire film, she's dead set on chasing down Snow White, but for that like little half second, she looks at the camera. It feels like she can jump out at the screen and, strangle you to death or make you drink some sort of potion or something. It's really,
Well,
again, yeah, it's really awesome.
well, it's funny because she's kind of like, oh, you're in on this too.
Uh-huh.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And moving on from our favorites, let's go ahead and talk about our quote unquote least favorite parts of the film. Now, for me, I don't think this necessarily counts as like a part of the film. For me, my least favorite part of the film is the prince. And I feel like that's something everybody touches on when they talk about, when they talk about
Yeah.
this film, is how little the prince shows up in the film. And actually, you guys, I did the calculations. The prince only has roughly 2 minutes and 17 seconds of screen time, which equates to around 2.74% of the entire movie.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
again, my least favorite part is the prince. You guys should be proud that I managed to calculate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, Matt. I think the romance in general is the weakest part of the film, and it's funny because the romance is so often a point of criticism of the film
Mhm.
today. I think rightfully so, but where it's kind of the criticism is a little bit off is because for some reason we tend to believe that that's what the film is centered on,
Mhm.
and I mean, again, it's not. It might be part of Snow White's overall wants and needs and desires. But, and yeah, I think that might be a weak part of the film. I don't think that that is necessarily an intended thing, but the film spends so much time uh, um, building the developing the dwarfs characters
Mm.
and the queen's characters that's where the heart of the film is, and the dwarves in relation to Snow White, and uh I mean, that's what makes the film so good and so strong and worth watching. But the romance is not well developed at all. And not at all. And part of the problem with that is the prince. Um, he has no personality. He's not
Mm.
developed as a character at all. I even think his character animation isn't even the strongest. It's really curious to me, and it's interesting as we go on this journey through animation. We'll see them try to, whenever they do a more European fairy folk tale that involves a romance between a prince and a princess, that you'll see each subsequent time how they try to develop the prince so that the
Mhm.
romance becomes more rewarding. Um, in terms of the film, and we'll talk about that when we get to those films. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the weakest part of the film. And it not that it makes the ending feel anticlimactic, because it actually, you feel so removed from it that you're kind of reminded that, okay, I'm watching something that's a set fairy folk
Mm-hmm.
tale. Um and the ending is like, it's angelic, it's surreal, it's
Yeah.
fantastical. It reminds you that you're watching a fantasy when they ride off like that. I
Mm.
don't think you're necessarily, because it's so underdeveloped, the romance, I don't think you're supposed to really feel, well, maybe, I think maybe you are supposed to feel, I think Walt would want you to feel strongly about them living happily ever after, but it's not
Mm.
what you walk away with. You don't really do. You feel more strongly about the dwarves and their resilience and their
Yeah.
and how they got to know Snow White really well and stuff like that. You feel more toward that, and then you're kind of thrust into this really, you're reminded that this is a fairy tale. It's
Mm-hmm.
something kind of set in stone. Um, it doesn't really detract from the film because all the other elements are so strong,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
but it is weak. It is really the weakest part of the film.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned all the other tries in the future that the company tries. I was going to compare this to a film, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, Sleeping Beauty, by, of course, the Walt Disney Company. In that film, well, I guess we'll to it.
We'll
But if
get
you,
there. Yeah.
yeah, if you compare these two romances from this prince to the prince in Sleeping Beauty,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
really no comparison there, but...
Well, we'll say this. One is so much more rewarding and developed, and the other isn't.
Whoa, yes, well put. And now, moving on to our final summation of the film. Overall, I guess you could say what our final thoughts on the film are.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs really is the one that started it all. It really shows this sense of the artist transitioning from an era of cartoons and experimenting with the form of cartoons to experimenting with this brand new form. And I think at the end of this conversation, one thing I'm left with and struck with that I didn't really think about before is the collision of those two worlds,
Mm-hmm.
the cartoon world and this whole brand new world in front of them, of a brand new form that they're now excited to pursue and build on. Um, and so it's really, yeah, it's an exciting starting place of new things to come for the form. And I rank it very highly because it's such an achievement, because it had never been done before. And really, all the films after, the feature length animated films already been done. So they've already made it past that
Mm-hmm.
monumentous, impossible achievement. And now they can just play. And they've created it so they can break the rules, because they're the ones who set precedent to begin with. And
Mm-hmm.
we will see that in the films to come. But it's interesting to see how it starts. And that's why this film, I think, will rank highly on a lot of people's lists because of that historical precedent. So that's my final verdict on this film, is that it's great. I give it 5 poison apples or 5 goose or 5 gooseberry pies, whichever
Oh.
you prefer.
Well, I like the way you phrased it. A good starting point. Yeah, of course, my opinion, I'll lay down. I'll give it 4 gooseberry pies out of 5. It's not my
Ooh.
favorite film out of the ones we're going to be watching, but again, you have to acknowledge where the context of the film, the first ever full-length animated film, gotta give it some credit for that. But yeah, again...
A lot of credit.
Yeah, a lot of credit.
That's okay.
And now, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Where should we rank this on our Matterhorn movies list of great Disney films? I feel like this, of course, is the first, so
Well,
we rank
this
this
is the
number
first
1.
film. Exactly. This is the first film we're tackling, so right now it sits at number 1. Even if we both gave it 1-star reviews, it would still be number 1. So we'll see what dethrones it in the future.
I have a feeling
It's going to
very
happen
next
sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for joining us on our very first Journey Through Animation covering Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Next episode, we will of course be tackling the very lovely Pinocchio. Very excited to get into a discussion about that. Very excited
So excited.
And we're excited for you guys to join us on our Journey Through Animation.